I'll get him out one way or another, through the window or through the door. Those were the words of France Telecom ex-CEO DJ Lombard in 2007. More than 30 employees committed suicide between 2008 and 2010, and he said these words to his management team during the privatization of France Telecom. A widow is talking here on the left to DJ Lombard. And in December 2019, Lombard was found guilty of institutional moral harassment. Chief Empathy Officer? No, not so much. The Chief Empathy Officer, how CEOs perceive the responsibility for establishing psychological safety in a management team. So the starting point of my research was the question, how do CEOs perceive the responsibility for establishing psychological safety in a management team? My research triggers were that the impact CEOs and other executives had on me, mentally and physically, from happy and fit to physically and mentally ill, and that the level of psychological safety could play a role here. So my research purpose is to understand what drives a CEO's behavior with respect to psychological safety. Are CEOs aware and mindful of psychological safety, and how do they see its purpose? Does personality or personal experiences play a role? Or organizational experience such as transformations or layoffs and societal changes? And what benefits, costs and impacts do they see? How do CEOs perceive their responsibility? So I've used this model to research my topic and structure the interviews. So the awareness of psychological safety should influence the trigger to establish psychological safety, but also the perceived impact of psychological safety. And together they should influence the perceived responsibility for establishing psychological safety. And a manifestation of establishing psychological safety, which is the behavior. So then I went to the library for answers, and I have 119 sources. The main three questions in my literature review were: why the CEO, why now, and what is the role of psychological safety? So why the CEO? The CEO calls the shots. The leadership is ultimately in the hands of the CEO. The CEO sets a tone for the entire organization, and the CEO has a unique position and is considered the corporate leader who impacts performance. And the CEO is the most powerful and influential member of the management team, the architect. It's the CEO's view of the world. The ambition and management style of the CEO stands out from the management team. The personal characteristics of the CEO influence the strategy and performance. It's the CEO's perceptions, cognitions and values. And CEO's decisions are based on personal interpretations of the situation. Why now and why not earlier? On the left you see a red bar, and this bar indicates the space for psychological safety. Well, there was not so much space during the second industrial revolution. It was all about standardization and industrialization, and leadership is innate. You're born with it, the great man theory. And leaders focus on employee productivity, and people need basic food and shelter. During the interbellum it was all about mass production, but human relations movement came up. Leadership traits could be trained and gained, it was the trait theory. And leaders focus on employee satisfaction, and people need better health and living standards. But there were the first signs of focus on the satisfaction and well-being of employees as part of the human relations movement by Mayo and the Hawthorne studies. Post-World War II, it was about customization and labor flexibility, and leadership is behavior, behavioral theory, and leaders focus on professional relationships with employees. People have esteem needs, dignity, achievement, mastery, status and prestige. And Shine and Dennis describe psychological safety as to which extent individuals feel secure and confident in their ability to manage change. Then there was the third industrial revolution from 1969 onwards. It was all about electronics and high-level automation. Contingency theory, saying there's no best leadership, and leaders focus on employee motivation. People have cognitive needs, higher education, exploration. It was Kahn who said, psychological safety fosters employee engagement. And then the rise of the knowledge economy. This is where we are right now. It's all about innovation through knowledge and technology. Leadership should be supportive, for instance, path goal theory. And leaders focus on employee empowerment, and people have self-actualization needs. The society focuses on diversity and inclusion. We want to have an egalitarian and communitarian society. And Edmondson defines psychological safety as a climate in which people are comfortable expressing and being themselves. In 2012, Julia Rosowski started the project Aristotle at Google, answering the question, what drives team performance? 2 years later, she said, everything fell in its place with psychological safety. It is vital to our success. But is psychological safety really the silver bullet? So psychological safety mediates and moderates between incidents and outcomes. You have input or antecedents, for example, organizational context, team characteristics, leadership or personality traits. And then you have output or outcomes, which is, for instance, team climate, innovation, learning, performance and improvement in or by a team. And psychological safety either explains these outcomes as a mediator or influences the outcomes as a moderator. So when we look at our needs of today, for instance, value creation through knowledge and innovation, then we can say that transformational leadership, psychological and relational capital, leads to innovative behavior in teams and cultivates creative problem solving and team knowledge creation. This is mediated by psychological safety. Leaders need to engage and demonstrate supportive leadership. Authentic, humble and supportive leadership leads to trust, ownership, courage, engagement, no fear and a safe climate. This is mediated by psychological safety. Employees expect empathy and empowerment. Well, formal mentoring leads to better performance, lower turnover, higher commitment. We also need positive feedback and praise from empathic leaders with traits of agreeableness and conscientiousness. This is also where psychological safety mediates. And people want to realize personal potential, seeking personal growth. Learning from failures leads to better performance and supports personal growth and development. Also here, psychological safety mediates. But for societal needs such as diversity and inclusion in an egalitarian and communitarian society, it's a little bit different. Diversity reduces the in and out group, and also more perspectives is better for creativity. However, heterogeneity in teams can lead to conflict and reduce cohesiveness, causing lower satisfaction and citizenship behavior. Psychological safety mediates almost all of our needs of today. So how do the CEOs see it? What is the actual perception of the CEO? I had structured interviews with 10 CEOs in 9 industries between November and January, and the duration was 85 minutes and I have more than 300 pages of text. All of the CEOs were male, 4 of them were Swiss, 4 Dutch, 1 Belgian and 1 Danish. The average age of the CEOs was 45.4 years. They were 4.6 years in their current job and close to 7 years being a CEO and 13 years in leadership. They have on average 7.5 management team members, 458 FTEs, and they have 19 locations to manage. 4 of them are Dutch and 6 of them are Swiss. Some are shareholders in a private ownership, some companies are subsidiaries, and some are owned by private equity. Let's have a look at the research results. I thought that the awareness of psychological safety would influence the perceived impact of psychological safety and would also influence the trigger to establish psychological safety. No, awareness does not play a role for the CEO. It's more about the phenomenon. So the purpose is clear for the CEO. It's about driving business performance, it's about people engagement, it's about people development, and finally also about team dynamics. The main trigger to establish psychological safety is negative professional experiences. 9 interviewees had unsafe experiences at work, and it was for them a trigger to establish psychological safety, but also positive professional experiences and business performance. There was a minor role for societal factors. What I found very interesting was that the negative impact of the absence of psychological safety weighs heavier than the positive impact of the presence of psychological safety. So they were more concerned about the harming effects on leadership than the reinforcing effects on their leadership. So the construct is not important, but business performance and engagement is. Having felt unsafe plays a key role, and absence impacts more. The perceived responsibility for establishing psychological safety. The good news, all CEOs are perceivers. Perfect. But it's a team effort. It should not lead to letting go of responsibility and accountability of team members, and team alignment is essential, preferably in a heterogeneous constellation, but not at the expense of team alignment. So CEOs perceive it as a responsibility, but not unconditional. But most CEOs support the management team organization context, give clear direction, set goals achievable and within time, and create management team psychological safety, and provide management team coaching. But there seems to be a boundary condition that could hinder CEOs to turn perception into behavior. And that's the span of control. It's the number of employees, the number of sites, and a management team size. There's a limit to how much time and attention CEOs can devote to psychological safety in the management team. So the takeaways from my study and the interviews. CEOs may not have heard of it, but they do know what it stands for. Having heard of psychological safety is not an antecedent. It's more important to be aware of the phenomenon rather than the social construct for establishing psychological safety. The values and belief system, but also negative professional experiences, are essential triggers to establish psychological safety. It's the ethic of reciprocity that matters more. It's about the golden rule: treat others as you would like others to treat you, and do not treat others in ways that you would not like to be treated. And psychological safety appears to be a hygiene factor. Negative impact of the absence of psychological safety weighs heavier than the positive impact of the presence of psychological safety. So psychological safety is perceived to be a working condition rather than a responsibility. And a puzzle piece can only fall into place when it fits with the other puzzle pieces, which are the boundaries, and boundary conditions hinder behavior. Psychological safety can only work when the team members can be held accountable and responsible for their task performance. Team alignment is more critical than heterogeneity, and the span of control of a CEO seems to impact how much effort and time can be allocated to establish psychological safety. Socialization of psychological safety is the process of learning to behave in a way that is acceptable to society. The ivory towers have come down over the years. CEOs have become more approachable. Machines are overshadowed by value creation by knowledge workers. CEOs are more empathic and concerned about employees' feelings, more communicative and supportive, less commanding, and realizing that employees' capital is their knowledge and that societal pressure and changes cannot be ignored. CEOs see it as their responsibility to establish psychological safety. It's a working condition. And then I realized that my research model did not really make sense anymore. So I changed it to a cognitive hierarchy framework because that fits much better. I took awareness of psychological safety out. I moved trigger to establish psychological safety to values and beliefs. And I moved perceived impact and perceived responsibility to attitudes and perceptions. And manifestation of establishing psychological safety, I moved it to behavior. And then you have a cognitive hierarchy framework. Personality dimensions, values and beliefs, attitudes and perceptions, and behavior. Within personality dimensions, I took agreeableness and conscientiousness, as they are key antecedents of psychological safety. Which brings me to the next slide. The leader's agreeableness and conscientiousness are key antecedents. So concern for employees' needs, and speak up, and praise, and satisfaction, and performance all get better. So remember, the CEO is the top dog. So establishing psychological safety for CEOs with an antisocial personality, and sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies, or a narcissistic personality will be challenging, as they score very low on agreeableness and conscientiousness, and therefore lack empathy or feelings towards others or a situation. More prominence for the Chief Empathy Officer. Not this guy. So my recommendations. There should be congruence between words and actions with respect to the perception of responsibility for and establishing of psychological safety. Appoint a Chief Empathy Officer. The CEO recruitment emphasis should be on personality assessments in conjunction with interviews focusing on personal values and belief systems and personal experiences with psychological safe and unsafe workplace situations. Number 2, develop psychological safety from the bottom. So when a psychological safe climate is identified, it should be praised, which reinforces psychological safety as a mediator for people engagement. Replicate psychological safety from the bottom to widen the set from which the future CEO is chosen. The third one, optimize the span of control. The complexity can be reduced by downsizing the management team or the number of locations, but only do this when it does not impact the overall performance of the company. Balance between span of control and how much time and attention is required to be dedicated to establish psychological safety. And then some final words. This project has provided me with answers, directions and values. I found closure with my setbacks from the past, and also the role of negative experiences impacts how you lead and treat others. It's about reciprocity. And what I found very interesting, how behavioral change really works. It's really about changing the values to change the attitude and to change the behavior. You have to start with the values. And the power of empathy. It's so much power. And I think especially now, more than ever. Thank you very much.